What it do, Recon crew? Hey man, listen, today we are bedtime maxing, not only with the Timu version of his intro, but with this tier list that we're doing. Check this out. Whoa. Interim title tier list for those of y'all who, can't read that. We're going to be ranking all the interim titles that have ever happened in the UFC. There's about 24 of them, and they have not all been created equally. Some of them are basically undisputed titles. Some of them are pretty legit. Some are interim as others are just promotional bullshit. Some need to just burn in fire. So without further ado, let's get started on this tier list. And we're going to kick it off with our most recent entry to the list of interim champions, Mr. Cyril Gane. Old baguette fingers himself. Yes, he is one of two men on this list to win the interim gold twice. And he is the most recent interim champion, getting that belt at the White House against Alex Poatan Pereira. Now, how legitimate is this interim title? Well, you got to look at why the interim belt was actually up for grabs. It's because the undisputed champion, Tom Aspinall, was injured, which is a very legitimate reason and one of the more common reasons for there to be an interim title opportunity. However, unique to this situation is the fact that Cyril Gane is the cause of that injury, and he caused it with fouls. So for that reason, and that reason alone, burn in fire. Also, while Alex Poatan Pereira is an absolute legend, he'd never actually fought at heavyweight before, and I think he's like number 4 now in the rankings, which is odd because he did get absolutely steamrolled by Cyril Gane. But anyways, yeah, he fought a guy who was a former middleweight champion, former light heavyweight champion, making his heavyweight debut for an interim title that he himself is the cause of. So, burn in fire, and I hate to say that because that interim title, the America belt, as an American myself, looked pretty sweet, and I hate that it was not won by an American. But there was no American in that fight, so that was never going to happen. We move on to the other American that won a title at the White House, Mr. Justin Gaethje, who is, of course, the other man to hold 2 interim titles. Justin Gaethje and Cyril Gane are the only men to win an interim belt twice. Now, we are talking about his second interim title victory, which was over Paddy Pimblett. The champion at the time was, of course, Ilia Topuria. And the reason the interim title was on the line was Ilia was away, not with an injury, but for personal matters, this whole, divorce situation. So a unique but pretty legitimate reason for an interim title. The champion was not there to answer the call. He wasn't there available to fight and defend for his belt. Now, so on that note, this is a fairly legitimate interim title. There was a reason to have an interim title. However, I don't think I can put this up in the pretty legit or the undisputed category, considering the number one contender at the time wasn't involved in the fight. Mr. Arman Tsarukyan was passed over, and this was a fight between Paddy Pimblett and Justin Gaethje, who I forget exactly where they were in the rankings. I might put it on the screen now. But yeah, these were not the number one contenders. You could argue Charles Oliveira was more deserving as well, considering he has a win over Gaethje. But in retrospect, Gaethje did unify this title in shocking fashion at the White House as a huge underdog. So you got to give this belt some respect, especially with that hindsight. But the actual interim title win itself over Paddy Pimblett, I'm going to put it into the interim AF category. We needed an interim belt, but it wasn't the 2 best lightweights outside of the title holder fighting for it. And I mean, still to this day, I think a lot of people would pick Arman and Charles to beat Justin Gaethje. Hell, people might pick Quillen Salkild to beat Gaethje these days. He's getting disrespected a lot, but, I would also probably pick some of those fighters to beat him. And now that we have covered our 2026 interim title holders, let's jump back 10 years to Mr. Jon Bones Jones. Now, Jon Jones was the interim champion in 2016, and it was, of course, at light heavyweight. He beat Ovince St. Preux by decision, and the active, or I should say inactive champion, who was the undisputed champion, was Daniel Cormier. Now, if you weren't around 10 years ago, many of you probably already know this story. Jon Jones was the champion. He'd actually beaten Daniel Cormier already. He got stripped of his title when he hit a pregnant lady with his car and ran away from the scene of the crime. Absolute legend that he is. So DC becomes undisputed champion. Jon Jones eventually gets off of his suspension and fights OSP. He was supposed to fight DC in his comeback fight for his own belt, but DC had to pull out of that fight due to a foot injury. I believe it was gout from his diet. Not confirmed, just a theory of mine. Anyways, I see this as a real undisputed belt. At the end of the day, whatever you think of Jon Jones as a person and why he was stripped of his belt, he beat Daniel Cormier. He beat him twice. One got overturned during no contest, when he got stripped again. And he actually was stripped of this interim title when he popped for, I believe that was the picograms, or maybe that was the cocaine metabolites. I don't really recall. But yeah, the guy was the best 205er in the world, briefly disputed and then quickly undisputed again. He beat Daniel Cormier twice. So whatever you think of Jon Jones, this interim belt just was the real belt. No two ways about it. Up next, let's kick it back to 2003 for the first ever interim title that was ever put up for grabs. And the winner of that belt was one Mr. Randy Couture, who is, fun fact, the other light heavyweight interim title holder. There's only ever been two, and it was Jon Jones and Randy Couture. Now, history lesson for those of y'all who were not watching the UFC in 2003, which is myself included. I definitely had to do research for this one. He beat Chuck Liddell to get this title. The undisputed title at the time was held by Tito Ortiz. Now, Tito was really supposed to be fighting Chuck Liddell, but that didn't happen due to a contract dispute where Tito was, some say ducking, some say holding out for more money, but kind of refusing to fight Chuck Liddell for that belt under at least the circumstances offered. So they ended up doing a interim title, and it was between Randy Couture and Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell, with a lot of people expecting Chuck to knock Randy out and then, fight Tito. But of course, Randy Couture had other plans. Now, he did still need to beat Tito Ortiz to really make this feel undisputed and solidify his claim to the title. So I can't quite put it in that S tier undisputed category, but I think it's pretty legit, all things considered. So I am going to put it in the pretty legit category, And I will note, this interim list has really put into perspective for me how much you should value title defenses, because, you could have easily had Randy Couture fight Tito Ortiz and then defend his belt against Chuck Liddell. If you do it in the other order, it counts it as a title defense. So a lot of these interim belts, they don't end up being counted as the real belt. And then when you unify, that's not a title defense. But, sometimes it feels like it should have. So I kind of care more about who they beat, when they beat them, how they beat them, the context around it when you're talking about, Mount Rushmore of MMA and the GOATs and all that stuff. Because the promotion has so much say in who gets title shots. And, it's not meritocracy, especially in the more recent fights. A lot of these earlier interim titles had a lot more legitimacy, whereas the promotional BS tends to be in the 2014 and onward half of this list. So, yeah. Up next, we're going to talk about a man who fights at light heavyweight, but is a former middleweight interim title holder and eventual undisputed title holder. It is none other than everyone's favorite Australian, Bobby Knuckles, the Reaper. Now, he became the interim title holder in July of 2017. This was at middleweight, of course. And he was eventually promoted to undisputed. He didn't actually unify it against the active champion at the time, which was Michael Bisping, who pretty blatantly, I would say, ducked not only him, but really ducked Yoel Romero, who is, of course, the guy Robert Whittaker had to fight to get this belt. So, yeah, Bobby Knuckles beat Yoel Romero by decision. He actually ended up having to fight him twice and didn't get a title defense for it because Yoel missed weight in the second fight by half a pound or something, or 0.2. It was very little. And for some reason, that equals no title defense. Not just that he couldn't win the belt, but no title defense, which is pretty crazy to think that Robert Whittaker has no title defenses. It doesn't feel right, but that is technically true. But anyways, yeah, I think this belt was and should be looked at as the undisputed belt, and I give Whittaker credit for a title defense against Yoel, at least if you believe he won those fights, because I know some people don't. But as far as the actual legitimacy of this interim title, I mean, there's a reason Michael Bisping wanted, 40-plus-year-old Dan Henderson instead of Yoel or Jacare or Bobby Knuckles. And, then he took on GSP in a money fight instead of Yoel or Bobby Knuckles. And if you look at the actual timeline of when this stuff happened, it was pretty crazy. I mean, and then GSP, who beat Michael Bisping, dropped that belt, said no thank you, and Bobby Knuckles gets promoted. When he won the interim title, you actually had Bisping in the cage talking about fighting him, and then it just never happened. So, yeah, I would say it's pretty legit. Now, on to the man that took that gold off of Robert Whittaker. The great Israel Adesanya, Izzy, the style bender. The man from New Zealand, the man from Africa, the man from China. The man from around the world. Israel Adesanya fought Kelvin Gastelum for this interim belt because Bobby Knuckles pulled out of his fight where he was supposed to defend the belt against Kelvin Gastelum, which honestly sounds crazy to say these days with how Kelvin's been doing, that he was once challenging for the middleweight strap. But yeah, he fought a legitimate number one contender. The champion pulled out on, I believe it was the eve of that fight. And Israel Adesanya showed out and won in one of the greatest title fights I've ever seen. To this day, this is a legendary fight. I think it's in the Hall of Fame, if I'm not mistaken. And then Izzy went on to dominantly unify those titles against Robert Whittaker. Now, I'm not going to put this in the undisputed category because at the time of winning the interim title, he still needed to beat Robert Whittaker to prove its legitimacy. But given the context, I can put it into pretty legit. I think this was a pretty legit interim title, and he did eventually unify it and get that undisputed. This was one of two belts that was put up in 2019 as far as interim belts go. The other went to the legend himself, everybody's favorite flight risk. It's going to be bad. Dustin the Diamond Poirier. Now, he fought Max Holloway instead of the champion Khabib Nurmagomedov, who was serving a suspension due to his brawl at 229 after the McGregor fight where he jumped into the crowd. So Khabib was healthy and willing to fight, but due to, athletic commission reasons and UFC punishments, he could not defend his title. So how legit is this belt? Well, not Poirier's fault, but it should have been Poirier-Khabib, and we did eventually see how that fight would go. So with hindsight, we know he obviously never went on to win undisputed, and he did actually, fight Khabib, and it didn't go that great for him. He fought Max Holloway for this interim title, who is a legend, but at the time was not a proper lightweight. This wasn't Maximus Holloway. This was a short notice step up for Max Holloway, so I don't think this was the best version of Max Holloway at lightweight. So considering the hindsight, the context, and the fact that he fought a bloated up featherweight, I kind of got to put this in the promotional BS category, and I feel bad doing it because, we all love Dustin Poirier. Hold on. I'm getting a call, boys. What? You said what? Is this Dustin Poirier? It's going to be bad. Nah, bro, I don't want the problems. I'm sorry. I'll move you up a tier. I got you. All right, we're going to be moving this one actually up to interim AF, considering the phone call I totally just received. Hope that bit landed for you guys. Moving on to Dustin's former teammate and known, hated, not rival, but guy that Dustin Poirier doesn't care for, Colby Covington. Now, I know a lot of people watching this don't like Colby, and I don't like all the fighters on this list myself. I'm trying to not let personal opinions of whether I like these fighters or not, weigh in too hard here with where I rank them. So let's talk about the context, right? Colby Covington beat RDA by unanimous decision to win this belt. And I believe this was maybe the last of the old school looking belt. It was one of the last ones before they changed it to the new one. I really like the look of the old belt personally. I've never really cared for the newer one. It's grown on me a little bit, but it still kind of looks like a Power Rangers belt. Anyways, Tyron Woodley was the champion at the time, and I do believe Colby Covington would have beat Tyron Woodley at the time if he ever got to do that. Unfortunately for Colby, this was a bit of a promotional belt to fuck with Tyron at the time, who the UFC was pretty unhappy with, who wasn't particularly inactive. But I also know from what eventually happened when they fought that Colby Covington most likely would have become an undisputed champion if he had gotten to fight Woodley. Unfortunately for Colby, that whole Kamaru Usman becoming champion thing happened before Colby got to fight for the belt again. He got stripped. He had to fight Robbie Lawler. All this stuff happened, right? All because Colby couldn't turn around immediately because he had to have nose surgery or something. So the UFC hoed Colby pretty bad by giving him this title opportunity and then stripping it from him almost immediately. He got super trolled and was never able to get over the hill that was Kamaru Usman. So I obviously can't call this an undisputed belt since Usman was very much around at the time and was probably the other guy kind of waiting around the top 5 to beat Tyron Woodley. But RDA was a pretty legit contender at welterweight at the time. He had come up from lightweight and was looked at as one of the best fighters in the world. And we do know that Colby eventually beat Woodley. So I'll put this into the pretty legit category. I can't count it as an undisputed belt, but it is pretty legitimate. Staying in the welterweight division, we have Carlos Condit, welterweight, February of 2012. He fought not George St Pierre, but Nick Diaz. to a decision, and he beat Nick Diaz because Nick ran out of time, guys. I'm not coping. I'd say it was pretty legit, right? GSP was injured, so there was a reason to put up an interim title fight. And Nick was the legitimate number one contender at the time. He was the Strikeforce champion. That's got to be factored in here as well, that he was a legit champion from another org at a time where other organizations' champions were, coming into the UFC and winning belts, or at least fighting for them. But ultimately, Carlos Condit did kind of get melted by GSP. Although, people forget, man, Carlos did drop GSP. And Carlos Condit was fucking nasty. I didn't get to watch much of his career. This is a bit before my time, but I was researching back through his fight catalog, through his Tapology, and Carlos Condit was a monster in his time. So, yeah, given GSP was out with, I believe, a torn ACL and sidelined for a year, legitimate reason for a title fight, but knowing that he was not able to beat GSP, I can't say that this should be looked at as an undisputed. This was a true interim title, and a pretty legit one, since he did beat the number one contender and the Strikeforce champion in Nick Diaz. So we'll put it in the pretty legit category. Next up, we have my favorite fighter on opposite day, Cyril Gane. His first title fight. And it's going to come off like I'm hating on Cyril Gane, because I like hating on Cyril Gane. But genuinely, this fight was promotional BS at its peak. I should have done this one first to define the category. And it is the first one that will be staying in promotional BS. He beat Derek Lewis by a TKO in Houston, and the undisputed champ at the time, Francis Ngannou, wasn't hurt. It was promotional gamesmanship from the UFC to fuck with Francis Ngannou. He had won the belt just 4 months prior and wanted to fight that September. This fight happened in August, so there was no need for an interim belt. Honestly, you could say burn and fire for this one, but I think this truly is the definition of just promotional BS. And when he did eventually fight Francis Ngannou, he didn't win that belt. So you can't really call this legitimate in any way. Albeit that was a very close fight with Francis, and if Cyril Gane made better decisions instead of dropping for leg locks, perhaps he could have won against the Francis Ngannou with no working knees. But he didn't, so we're putting this into promotional BS. And one thing worth noting about this title fight, here's me extending my olive branch to the Cyril Gane fans. Cyril Gane did do the funniest thing on his walkout in Houston. I used to live in Houston. I had my first Muay Thai fight there. Shout out H-Town, baby. He walked out to a classic Houston banger. I think it was Still Tippin', if I remember correctly. And that's like a Houston rap song that's pretty, I think it's well known outside of Houston or Texas. But yeah, it is like peak Houston rap. And the whole crowd, They forgot that Derek's walking out second. They heard the music and they thought it was Derek Lewis walking out because they didn't show who it was when the music started playing. And there's videos from in the crowd. You can look this up on YouTube. Maybe I'll throw it in here. But yeah, the whole crowd was getting amped up thinking it's their guy, the Houston native. Well, not Houston native, Louisiana native. Like any true Houstonian, Derek Lewis is from New Orleans. But yeah, Cyril Gane walks out to Houston rap. Everyone gets amped, and then they show him on the camera, and the crowd immediately starts booing. Absolutely hilarious. Sick troll from Cyril Gane. He is kind of a sick troll. You do got to give him that elite rage bait. I want to root for Cyril Gane. I was actually a fan of Cyril Gane back when he was, fighting Francis and stuff, but I just can't look over all of the fouls. And speaking of, let's stay on topic here and rank Mr. Tommy Aspinall next. Tom Aspinall. Now, I think this is a pretty legit one, right? He stepped in on very short notice, I think less than 10 days. I think it was 4 or something, and KO'd the scariest guy in that division, the number one contender, Sergey Pavlovich, who was on a historic not just win streak, but finish streak, knockout streak. The scariest guy in the division. Tom Aspinall stepped in there and, turned the tables. He knocked out Sergey Pavlovich quite quickly. So at the time, I would have said this is pretty legit. But considering Jon Jones completely avoided this fight, and Tom Aspinall also, defended this belt, the interim belt, I think you kind of got to look at this as an undisputed title win over Sergey. That was the most top-ranked heavyweight at the time because Jon Jones was never going to fight him. So would Tom Aspinall have beaten Jon Jones? I don't know. We'll never know. But yeah, it's very legitimate. At the time, I would have said pretty legit because Jon had torn his pec and he was pretending that he was going to fight Tom. But since he genuinely just ducked fighting Tom, you kind of have to look at this as the undisputed. That's kind of how it went. So let's keep it going with the heavyweights. Andrei Arlovski was a champion at one point. In 2005, he won the interim title. I think this was maybe the second interim title in UFC history. Yep, that is what my notes say. He beat Frank Mir. No, he didn't. He beat Tim Sylvia because Frank Mir was hurt. Frank Mir had, I believe, crashed a motorcycle and, had nearly died. So he was out for quite a while. So the interim belt was pretty needed, and Arlovski was eventually promoted to undisputed, where he went on to defend this belt twice. So you kind of got to look at this as an undisputed title win, as far as I'm concerned. The champion was not available for multiple years, and he fought the other top guys. He did actually eventually lose this belt to Tim Sylvia 3 fights later. And it is worth noting, he did eventually fight Frank Mir 10 years later, and Arlovski won by unanimous decision. So, yeah, I look at this as an undisputed title because there was no undisputed champion at the time. It was basically a vacant title, unfortunately. And it's hard to say, 10 years prior, if Frank Mir didn't get hurt, could Arlovski have beaten him? I don't know. I wasn't watching the UFC in 2005. I'm not going to pretend that I was. But yeah, this was the second interim title fight in the company's history. For number 3, we move to the welterweight division. 2, one of the greatest fighters of all time, Mr. George St Pierre. Now, how legitimate was this title? Well, he beat Matt Hughes via submission, which was a great win at the time. And the undisputed champ was Matt Serra. Now, Matt Serra, if you don't know, won the belt from George St Pierre. So I definitely can't call this undisputed because I think Mr. Matt Serra would have something to say about that, given he had knocked out GSP. And I don't even think I could say this is pretty legit, despite it being a very legit opponent, another top contender, because until you unify with Matt Serra, you can't really say this is a very legit title win as far as the undisputed. However, it wasn't promotional BS. Like this was needed. So this was an interim AF title win. Serra was out with a severe back injury. He wasn't available. GSP, did eventually beat Matt Serra and get his belt back. This was a legit number 1 contender type of fight with that rubber match with Matt Hughes. But until he went on to beat Matt Serra, you can't really credit this interim title as anything more than a placeholder, an interim title. So now let's skip forward to a title that I think absolutely needs to be viewed as undisputed and nothing less. And if you don't agree, bro, you can argue with me in the comment section. Mr. Tony Ferguson, the real belt, champ shit only. You guys are jealous. And keep in mind, this title has 2 defenses on it. He wasn't even gone a full year. 8-fight win streak, doesn't get the title shot because of Mr. Ireland man, Conor McGregor, that moved up to fight Eddie. He should have gotten to fight Eddie, and I think he would have beat Eddie. And then everything happens with Khabib. Tony gets the belt. He's then stripped. He still doesn't get to fight for undisputed gold when he comes back. He fought 2 more times before then eventually getting an interim title shot again with Justin Gaethje, who is not this one, but I haven't ranked that one yet. But yeah, he fights Justin Gaethje. That eventually ends the losing streak, or starts the losing streak, ends the win streak, goes on a historic downfall. But at the time of this win, Conor McGregor never tried to defend that belt. He didn't. And Tony kept winning. He won this belt, got stripped, and then kept winning. So I look at this as an undisputed belt. Tony Ferguson, I don't care about the downfall, is one of the greatest lightweights of all time. And anyone who's saying different is a hater. And let's just put this out there. Tony would have beat Conor McGregor. This version of Tony, before, tearing up his knee and losing to Justin Gaethje, I know people forget how good he was, but stylistically, you could say Khabib would have beat him with the wrestling. I think in retrospect, that's pretty certainly what would have happened. But let's not forget, y'all. Conor McGregor lost to Nate Diaz, who is not a real welterweight at that time. He's really just a bloated up lightweight. Tony Ferguson had the same attributes that Nate Diaz had in a better package. Iron chin, insane cardio, submission threats. But Tony Ferguson was KOing dudes and slicing them up with elbows in a way that Nate Diaz wasn't. So if you're losing to Nate Diaz, I think Tony Ferguson was just a harder version of that fight, essentially. So totally legitimate title, 10-fight win streak. Don't you ever forget it. I don't care that it was a submission over Kevin Lee. It's about the context, right? Because McGregor wasn't even in the sport at the time. He was fighting fucking Floyd Mayweather. Speaking of Mr. McGregor, Conor McGregor, featherweight, 2015. How legit is this title? Well, somewhat, right? Jose Aldo pulled out of their fight right before it happened, and Chad Mendes hopped in there. But Chad Mendes had already lost to Jose Aldo not once, but twice for that belt. So beating Chad Mendes doesn't really make you an undisputed champ, and it doesn't feel that legit. But there was a legitimate reason for the belt. And of course, he did eventually go on to, unify the title. But at the time of winning the interim belt, I think it was interim AF. It was a placeholder for this number one contender until he could get his title shot. You could put it in pretty legit, but I think I'm going to go with interim AF because I really talked myself into anger there thinking about T. Fergs, how dirty he got done. Because Conor went on to cause several interim titles after this with his shenanigans in boxing and just leaving the division. Speaking of Jose Aldo and the shenanigans that happened after this belt, Jose Aldo, featherweight, 2016. Probably going to be interim AF or even promotional BS. Let's talk about it, right? He fought Frankie Edgar. He beat him by a decision. The undisputed champion was Conor McGregor, who never came back, right? Conor knocked Jose out real bad. I think we all know that happened in their first fight. There was no second fight. So does beating Frankie Edgar make you the champion? Not really. He never got his chance to fight Conor. Should this have even been an interim fight? Well, yeah, Conor wasn't around, so there was a legitimate reason for it. But, when he got promoted later to undisputed, he got beaten by Holloway. He got TKO'd twice by Holloway, actually. So, yeah, it's either promotional BS or interim AF. I don't even think he was the best featherweight at the time outside of Conor because, like I said, he lost to Holloway twice. You probably should have had him fight Holloway in retrospect, but I'll put him in interim AF. We might move him to promotional BS if we run out of room here because we got a lot more titles to go through. So let's keep it moving. Max Holloway, the guy we were just talking about. See how I did this? All these fights in order. He fought Anthony Pettis and he defeated him by TKO to get his title shot against Jose Aldo. This was the classic corporate scramble, if you will. Aldo was the undisputed champion. He became undisputed champion without actually beating Conor McGregor because he wasn't available. And they made this fight, which is originally a co-main event on the DC Rumble card, an interim title, pretty much exclusively because DC and Rumble's fight fell out. Low-key a burn and fire belt, actually, because Pettis missed weight, so only Max could actually win it. But he did eventually beat Jose Aldo to get his belt. But was Jose really the best 145er? Conor was, but he didn't come back. Max lost to Conor at 145. He did eventually. People forget, man. He exploded Conor's knee, not once, but twice. So we're going to say promotional BS, which I hate to say because I love Max Holloway. But at the time, this interim title did not really represent being the best featherweight in the world. And we'll keep it rolling with Max Holloway and opponents of Max Holloway, Mr. Justin Gaethje and his first title victory of the interim variety against Tony Ferguson. Such a sad fight for me. Some people say he was actually well aware of this fight, and it was at short notice that his manager, which is the same manager as Khabib, Mr. Ali Abdelaziz, as Colby would call him, actually orchestrated this whole thing, knowing that Tony was, training grappling the whole camp and having Justin come in on short notice because Khabib totally had to go back to Russia. I don't believe that, obviously. I'm not salty and a Tony Ferguson fan. Anyways, how legit was this belt? Well, Khabib wasn't available for one reason or another, right? He was out for COVID stuff. He totally didn't duck Tony Ferguson. Whatever. But yeah, Justin snapped the incredibly nice win streak of Tony Ferguson in violent fashion. And, if I think Tony Ferguson is the legitimate title holder, then in a way, this should be undisputed, right? But Khabib was the undisputed title holder at the time. So I'm going to say this was pretty legit. It's pretty legit. Now, this was a Tony Ferguson who was past his prime, in my opinion. He had a knee injury, of course, that happened, and he wasn't at the time the interim title holder because he got stripped because of that knee injury. Tony was probably past his prime already, and Justin certainly put the nail in the coffin on his prime, kicking off a historic downfall that I don't know if I've ever truly forgiven Justin for, even though he is kind of the man. And he is the man right now, the true undisputed champion. But it took a lot longer to get that because, again, he did eventually fight Khabib, and he got triangled, lost in Abu Dhabi. So definitely can't call it an undisputed, but it was pretty legit. It was needed, and he beat a very legit opponent for it. Lightweight was such a mess at that time. A far less legitimate title win of the interim variety, a far less legit interim title, was Mr. Yair Rodriguez, who recently pulled out of the UFC Noche main event. He beat Josh Emmett by submission, which was a pretty sick win. I will give him credit for that finish. But yeah, Volk had already defended the belt 4 times and had just gone up to lightweight to challenge for another belt. He was only gone for a year. He left July 2nd and came back July 8th as far as, his 2 fights at featherweight. And beating Josh Emmett, while impressive the way he did it with a submission, that really wasn't representative of the best at featherweight at that time. So yeah, I think this was just promotional BS, and it was just done really to placate the Mexican fan base that the UFC is constantly trying to push themselves on and gain favor with the UFC Noche event and with the themed belt and with this other interim title that they did with Brandon Moreno, who was their eventual first champion from this country. But this interim title fight was, kind of promotional BS as well. I'm not trying to be a hater here on the Mexican interim champions, but he beat Kai Kara France by TKO, but really only because Figgy was having contract disputes and wanted more money. I think he was injured as well, but when he went on to fight Figgy, they went, 1-1 and 1 and 1. And then they fought, I think, 4 times. He should have probably been down 2-1, but Figueiredo got a point deduction in their first fight. Even with the point deduction, most of the media outlets scored it as a win for Figueiredo when they eventually fought. But yeah, we didn't really need this interim title. It was kind of in that era, pre-Paramount, where it was we have to have a belt on every pay-per-view because we sell pay-per-views. And considering how things eventually went when he fought Figueiredo, I can't really call this one legit. I wouldn't even say it was needed. Moving up 10 pounds to the bantamweight division, we have Petr Yan, bantamweight, 2021. This was after he lost his title via disqualification due to an illegal knee that he landed on one Aljamain Sterling. And the thing to remember about this belt was that Aljamain Sterling was champion at the time, and he had won it by DQ. Petr Yan couldn't fight Aljamain Sterling because he was out with a neck surgery. Petr Yan beat Corey Sandhagen, and Corey was a legit top 5er at the time. Probably not, the best guy in the division, but that could have easily also been a title defense had Petr Yan just not kneed Aljamain Sterling in the face. It is a little bit undermined by the fact that he did then lose the rematch with Aljamain Sterling, but at the time of winning it, which is what we're talking about here, I would have to say this was just the undisputed belt. I don't think most people respected Aljamain Sterling as the champion at that time, and it's definitely got to at least be a pretty legit title win. I would say a undisputed belt in everything but name. Man, it's kind of crazy to think about how good Petr Yan's legacy could have been if he just didn't throw that knee. There would have been no split decision rematch. He would have just beat Aljamain Sterling, and then as we saw in this interim title fight, could have easily defended against Corey. No robbery fight against O'Malley, maybe 5 rounds against O'Malley. That's another title defense. Eventually lose to Merab, but you can regain it with the right game plan. He can beat Merab. We're going to see how that rubber match goes, but yeah, Petr Yan could have easily become the GOAT of bantamweight if he just didn't knee Aljamain Sterling in the damn face. But that's not what happened. And speaking of bantamweight, we're going to stay in this division for our next one, Renan Barao. This was in 2012, July specifically. How should we look at this belt? Well, the title holder at the time was Dominic Cruz, and Renan Barao beat Uriah Faber via decision. He actually defended this interim belt not once, but twice, and then was promoted to undisputed. He didn't fight Dominic Cruz because Dominic Cruz was out with injuries, and he never got to fight Dominic Cruz. He was also on a 32-fight win streak, which is just insane. I don't care what level of competition that is. I mean, a 32-fight win streak, I don't care if it's street beef. So that's a crazy accomplishment, and this was certainly not street beef. So I got to say this was undisputed. He did eventually become champ. The real champion at the time, Dominic Cruz, just never fought him. So this really, in retrospect, was an undisputed title. That leaves us with 4 interim titles. We're almost done, and they are all heavyweights. Let's take a look at the breakdown of interim titles by division. Let's have a pie chart up here. Did I make one? Is it there? Good job, me in editing, maybe, if I remembered to do that. Also worth noting, no female interim titles. Nicely done, ladies. Or maybe it is that these interim titles are promotional, and the ladies don't pull in numbers as much Not sure. But I'm going to say nice job, ladies. I'm going to be nice here. Big Nog, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. This was in February of 2008, and it was not the most needed title. Randy Couture, a man we've talked about already, was the champion at the time. Big Nog beat Tim Sylvia by submission. Fun fact, Big Nog was the interim Pride Heavyweight champion at one point, as well as the first Pride Heavyweight champion. So he was a Pride interim champion and a UFC interim champion, but this was kind of promotional BS. He did, of course, end up beating Randy Couture, and he got skipped for the title shot for Brock Lesnar, which was kind of BS. So maybe this should be looked at a little higher on this list, because he did go on to beat Randy, but that was after Randy lost his belt. But he lost this belt defending against Frank Mir, not Brock. So I don't know, man. Honestly, kind of a hard one to place. Doesn't help that I definitely was not watching in 2008, as I would have been about 10 years old. So yeah, I'm going to give this like a moderate legitimacy score. I think we'll go with interim AF. Considering Couture was only out because of contract disputes with the company, which isn't Big Nog's fault, obviously, but like he should have been there to fight. Nogueira lost his interim belt to Frank Mir. He finally caught up with Couture later when he wasn't champion anymore, winning with a UD unanimous decision at UFC 102. So like there's arguments for this being an unnecessary belt, but he also did beat Randy, so I'll put it right at interim AF, I suppose. Frank Mir, promotional BS this belt was. I just realized I didn't actually have a picture of Frank Mir ready for this, and I miscounted. There were 25 interim titles, not 24. Get trolled, me. Anyways, Randy Couture, I keep mentioning him here. He was the title holder, and Frank would never actually get to go on to fight Randy Couture. He injured his knee before the unification bout could happen, and then was not actually stripped. Future interim title holders would be so lucky. Talking Tony Ferguson, talking Colby Covington, and others. Interim titles, I think they were a lot more legit in the past than in the future as far as the trend. Fun fact, Frank Mir actually fought for the belt 5 times. He went 1-1 on his interim title shots and 1-2 on undisputed. He won the vacant against Tim Sylvia and lost to Brock Lesnar and JDS for normal undisputed, non-vacant titles. Something Cyril Gane is trying to do with his, weird title shot record. He's fought for, 4 titles? 2 undisputed losses, 2 interim wins, a no contest, 5 fights for Cyril Gane, I guess? Am I adding that up right? Yeah. Cyril lost to Francis and Jon Jones for undisputed, a no contest against Tom Aspinall. Probably should have been a DQ, whatever. And then he won the interim twice. So yeah, Cyril Gane has also fought for a belt 5 times. 5 title shots, same as Frank Mir. And Frank Mir, who went 2-3 in his 5 title shots. Cyril Gane is 2-1. So yeah, Cyril Gane trying to mog here. Unsuccessfully, I would say. But yeah, how legitimate was this belt? Was it actually needed? Not really. Frank Mir, I don't want to disrespect the title win, but the reality is Randy Couture was available. He was only away, again, because of like contract disputes, something common with Randy back in the day. So this is just kind of promotional BS to fuck with the champion. Big Nog beat Brock Lesnar to get this opportunity with the Ultimate Fighter, I believe. And eventually, as we all know, when Frank rematched Brock Lesnar, he lost to him. So I'm going to say promotional BS because this was really just a tool to mess with the undisputed champion, Randy Couture. And that's kind of what you get in these promotional BS belts. It's a tool the UFC uses to mess with the undisputed champion or just to kind of elevate a fight to fill in a slot on a pay-per-view. Those are kind of the 2 reasons you get a promotional BS title. Now we've got another heavyweight interim title. Another heavyweight we need to talk about was the Shane Carwin interim title win in March of 2010. This is kind of the definition of interim AF, right? Because Brock Lesnar was out because of a injury, or I should say an illness with diverticulitis is the word I'm looking for. And his recovery was kind of lengthy. The return was kind of unknown, the timeline. So we needed an interim belt. However, in hindsight, the retrospect, we know that the fight that Shane had against Frank Mir, which was great, won by knockout, wasn't really representative of the best heavyweight at the time, considering the next fight for Shane at UFC 116 was Brock Lesnar. And when he fought Brock Lesnar, he got smoked. He got arm triangled in round number 2. and just wasn't the best heavyweight on the roster at that point. He never actually became undisputed, so interim AF. Legit reason to have an interim belt, but I don't look at this interim title around his waist as a pretty legit championship. As an undisputed, certainly not. But it wasn't promotional BS. There was a reason to have an interim title. And last but not least, the man who unleashed a boomerang on the head of Colby Covington, Fabricio Werdum. Now, the champion at the time was Cain Velasquez, and Fabricio fought Mr. Mark Hunt, the legend himself from kickboxing, for this interim title. And Fabricio went on to TKO him in November of 2014. They did an Ultimate Fighter season prior to the title fight with Cain Velasquez, but Velasquez pulled out for an injury, and Mark Hunt stepped in to fight Werdum on 3 weeks' notice. Fabricio, of course, beat Mark Hunt and did eventually unify his belt against Cain Velasquez, albeit at C level, so, not sure if it really counts. So Fabricio beat the undisputed champion and spawned in a meme. Now, when he won this title, you couldn't look at it as the undisputed. This title win itself wasn't the undisputed. He did need to beat Cain Velasquez to take that title. He did eventually do that. So I will put this in the pretty legit category. You needed it. He did go on to beat him. He was the best heavyweight at the time, but he still needed to prove it, right? Well, if you made it this far in the video, congratulations, because that is the end of the interim title tier list, and you have an S tier attention span. I'm very proud of you. Should I make more of these videos? I mean, if you made it to the end, I think you should give your input, because you're probably a core subscriber on this channel, because this is going to be a long video, I'm sure. It was fun to make, but yeah, I don't know if this is something y'all want to see more on this channel. Tier lists, I know some people like them, some don't really care for these videos. So if this has 10 views on it, I'll have my answer. If it gets 10,000, I guess I'll have my answer in the other direction. Until next time, like, subscribe, comment, hype, all that shit. I have been Recon MMA. I'll see y'all in the next video.